In July 1943, two gigantic armies met on the outskirts of the city of Kursk. Soldiers on both sides were aware that one of the fiercest battles ever was about to take place, and that its outcome would be key in defining the course of World War II. For Hitler, it was about regaining control of the Eastern Front. For the Russians, the goal was to break through the lines of the Third Reich and advance into the very heart of the Nazi Empire. The stakes were high, the German army and the Soviet army knew it, and they were prepared to go to the last consequences. A total of 3 million men, 4,400 aircraft, and an impressive 6,300 tanks prepared to fight. Never before had so many tanks been deployed, but the situation was critical, and both sides understood that these vehicles would be decisive. What happened next was a real carnage that brought a few surprises for both armies. But what were the causes of that confrontation? Join us for a new episode of Military History about Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. To understand the reasons for this battle, we have to go back a few months, to the Battle of Stalingrad. There, Hitler was defeated by the Soviets, who launched a brutal counteroffensive that forced the German forces back. The Führer believed that this gave a bad image to his allies, Italy and Japan, who, seeing this situation, were considering the possibility of surrendering. Defeating the Red Army was necessary to regain the initiative, raise the spirits of the Wehrmacht, encourage the Axis countries to continue fighting and, incidentally, get Russian prisoners to force them to work in German military factories. Hitler devised a cunning plan to exterminate the Soviets. He chose the Kursk salient as his battlefield, a territory 250 kilometers long and 160 kilometers wide that jutted into the German zone, with the idea of luring the Red Army there and attacking it by surprise with a pincer movement. The Soviet Union, however, was not going to let itself be surprised. It had known of Hitler's intentions for months thanks to British spies, so it had time to organize an adequate defense. The Red Army mobilized 300,000 civilians to build 6 defensive lines, each consisting of fortifications, minefields, barbed wire, trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles. Everything was prepared so that the 8,000 kilometers of Kursk trenches would become a death trap for Hitler's forces, who once there would have no escape. Although the Führer learned of the Soviet defenses, this did not alter his plans, and he decided to attack anyway, knowing that he would lose thousands of troops, but hoping to destroy the Red Army. The numbers of the armies were surprising considering that both had been worn out for months by their efforts in World War II. The Red Army was left in charge of General Zhukov and was made up of 1,300,000 men, 3,300 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces and 2,400 planes. For its part, the German army was in the hands of Marshal Erich von Manstein, and had 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks, 9,000 artillery pieces and 2,000 aircraft. Half of the Soviet Union's tanks were at Kursk, as they were needed to counter powerful state-of-the-art Nazi tanks. The German armored force was 90 Ferdinand tank destroyers, 211 Tiger heavy tanks and 259 Panther tanks. This last model is usually considered as one of the best tanks of World War II, the ace up the sleeve of the Wehrmacht since it was light and fast, had excellent firepower at great distances and a resistant armor. Meanwhile, the Soviets deployed their T-60 and T-70 tanks, although their main weapon was the T-34, a medium tank with armor powerful enough to withstand enemy artillery. The battle began on July 4th, with a series of bombing raids on Soviet defenses and marching German tanks. As the Nazis were making a pincer movement, the battle had two fronts. In the north, the Soviet defense was successful and the Germans were unable to advance more than 10 kilometers into the territory. In the south, the situation was different. The Red Army could not stop Hitler's soldiers, who penetrated their lines and reached the small town of Prokhorovka, where a particularly bloody battle took place. There, the tanks clashed and filled the battlefield with smoke, blood and dead, and most of the German main battle tanks were destroyed by mines and hidden Soviet anti-tank artillery. The Soviets succeeded at Prokhorovka, but at great cost, as their losses were also huge. General von Manstein was convinced that, despite the casualties, the battle could still be won. He asked Hitler for permission to deploy the tank reserve and launch one last attack on the Soviets, who were exhausted after so many days of fighting. But the Führer ignored von Manstein's advice and chose to guard the reserve, his caution being that the Allies had landed in Sicily and he did not want to risk losing all his tanks. In order not to be surrounded by his enemies, the Nazi leader withdrew his forces from Kursk and diverted them towards Italy. The Soviets took advantage of the withdrawal, and on July 15 they began a sweeping counteroffensive that allowed them to drive the Germans out of their territory and win the fight. At the end of the battle, the Third Reich had lost 200,000 men, 700 tanks, and almost 680 planes. Surprisingly, Red Army casualties were much higher, as they lost 850,000 soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft. However, these figures are controversial and there are those who claim that Soviet casualties were even higher. The Battle of Kursk was a turning point and its consequences extended throughout the rest of the war. After this defeat, Hitler's plans to conquer Russia were definitively shattered, and he never managed to regain the war initiative. From this moment on he went on the defensive, fighting on several fronts simultaneously, but in increasingly worse conditions, as he had the Allies on his heels from the south, and the Red Army advancing unchecked from the east. The fate of the Third Reich was sealed. Several experts claim that Germany's tactics were superior, but they lost their advantage by not breaking through the Soviet defenses, added to the fact that the Red Army had more resources, and was willing to sacrifice all of them in order to achieve a victory. There was also another important factor in the outcome of the battle. Hitler was used to ignoring his commanders, constantly intervening in their decisions and battle plans. The Soviet leader, Stalin, fully trusted his officers throughout the engagement and let them plan the tactical details without opposing them, giving them complete freedom of action. What do you think would have happened if Hitler did not withdraw his forces from Kursk and continue the attack? Leave your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. And stay tuned for our next video.